The U.S. Taiwan relationship is a little awkward because Beijing keeps causing drama. But should America even care about hurting the feelings of the Chinese people? No, these Chinese people. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell here in Taipei, Taiwan. You know, there's a lot of things the U.S. government can't say when it comes to Taiwan because of concerns about angering China's communist leaders. And no one knows that better than William Stanton. He's the former director of the American Institute in Taiwan. That's the de facto U.S. embassy here. So he's the former U.S. ambassador who can't be called an ambassador in a U.S. embassy that can't be called an embassy in a country that can't be called a country. So I sat down with him to talk about the future of this country. Thank you for joining me today.
Pleasure to be with you.
So if I call you the former U.S. ambassador to Taiwan, will I start a war with China?
Well, you could. They're very, how should I say, they're very orthodox about such
Orthodox
questions.
Is an interesting word for it.
Yeah. Well, you know, there's a lot of orthodoxy when you're talking about China. And they've got a lot of stipulations and rules, and unfortunately, in many ways, the rest of the world often abides by them. Mm-hmm. You may have seen just yesterday, I guess, there was a news report that they had criticized the 60-some-odd countries that had congratulated Tsai Ing-wen on her election victory here in China, and they said that was totally inappropriate.
So why is it that the President of the United States can meet with the leader of North Korea, but not the democratically elected president of Taiwan?
Beats me. I've never understood it. I mean, you know, why is it that up till now officials, military people can go in the Pentagon from Taiwan, but we've never allowed even low-level officials, although, you know, periodically I know that's been changed, but I mean, we've had Jerry Adams, a terrorist, was in the State Department. I think Yasser Arafat at one point visited the State Department. We've had all kinds of people come in the State Department. We've had Russian spies. We know that somebody came in and bugged the State Department at one point. So why is it that a fellow democracy, a friendly country, people we ought to have a closer relationship, why do these old-fashioned rules still guide so many of our policies? Although Congress now has at least twice passed laws that say we should have higher-level visits from American cabinet officers, for example, come to Taiwan. And why is it that, you know, the Taiwanese, also we've invited them to come at a higher level, but that never happens because we're not getting White House approval.
Well, it seems like for years the U.S. government has operated with the idea that we can't anger China. Why not?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you know, I've often said, you know, we may have hurt the feelings of the Chinese people, but the Chinese government has hurt the feelings of the American people because they do
That's how I feel.
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, they do all kinds of things in terms of their treatment of Muslims and Christians and, you know, the Falun Gong and any religion that they find dubious or doesn't strictly adhere to the precepts of now Xi Jinping thought, Marxist theory with Chinese characteristics. They object to it and it hurts their feelings. Well, you know, I'm sure most of the people of China don't know and don't care. But if you want, they can come up, I guess, with 2 million blog items saying that their feelings are hurt. But we shouldn't care. But, you know, this has become such a tradition. The only departure that I'm really aware of, I thought was George Shultz, who I knew when I was at the Hoover Institution for a year. And I'd worked before that, my wife at the time, she was a special assistant for him. So I got to know him, and I worked a little bit on his memoirs. And he made it clear that he understood that we should never value a relationship for its own sake. And that's in his memoirs. And according to him, that was Ronald Reagan's view as well. You have a relationship with a country because it's in your mutual interest and because you can accomplish things. To the extent you can't accomplish things that are mutually of interest to you, then there's no reason to worry about whether we're undermining the so-called sacred relationship. But we've also had, over the years, so many people who have retired from government and then made money leading CEOs from America to China and getting paid for it. And these people have maintained orthodoxy. But a lot of that has changed now. I began to notice it really in 2014, thereabouts. What it is clear is that people on both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, increasingly believe that the U.S.-China relationship is out of whack, and that it was serving one country's interests more than the other. So there's been a sea change now.
Well, I know you've argued that the U.S. and Taiwan should have a free trade agreement.
Absolutely.
What would that mean?
Yeah. Well, my argument is based on the fact if you look at all of the 20 free trade agreements that the United States has had, or just call it a trade agreement, all of them, I would say the principal motive for most of them was political and strategic. Mm-hmm. And for a few others, there was also, particularly the case of NAFTA, because Mexico and Canada are neighbors. They're not hostile neighbors.
I'm not convinced about Canada, but please carry on.
But the idea was that, we had interest in strengthening these countries. The very first free trade agreement was with Israel. And that wasn't for economic reasons. And then what followed were with moderate Arab states, which were basically more friendly toward Israel, like Morocco and Jordan and Oman. And then we did, Central American states, not because they were economically important, but because we hoped that would help stabilize their economies and would cut down illegal immigration and I suppose maybe drugs. I don't know about that. Chile and Peru, in large part, was because they were moving towards more capitalist systems in their governments.
So what would a free trade agreement with the U.S. and Taiwan do?
The main importance of it would be strategic, as a sign of U.S. endorsement and support for Taiwan, because Taiwan is kind of lonely out here a bit. And it would encourage other countries who have a relatively positive view toward Taiwan, like Japan, to think about trying harder to create free trade agreements, because the ultimate goal would be, and it's already happening as a result of the trade war between the United States and China, is that increasingly Taiwan doesn't want to be so economically dependent on China, on PRC. And so it would serve that purpose. It would make Taiwan, I think, a more attractive partner for other countries. And it would be a way of showing our support. I mean, after all, it's a country of 23 million people that's a democracy and friendly to us. Now, we don't give them any aid, but let's remember that it's over $3 billion last time I checked. I thought it was $3.5 billion in aid we give to Israel. Why do we do that? Well, there are historical reasons, but basically also we consider it a democracy that's friendly to the United States. So if we're doing it for Israel, why shouldn't we be more helpful to Taiwan? And I'm not saying give them money necessarily, but at least do a free trade agreement with them. And lower the cost of their exports. And we, they're already our 11th largest trading partner, so it's a significant country.
Well, I'm curious, besides a free trade agreement, what more could the U.S. do to support Taiwan?
Well, we've done some of it already under the current administration. We've been selling more arms that they've asked for. I think there's a lot more interaction between our militaries than is apparent, but we should increase it. if we're going to invite the Chinese, who have been declared a strategic competitor, which is a nice way of saying not very friendly, or worse, why don't we invite Taiwan? Now, possibly what would happen is other countries would say, well, we can't participate because it'll hurt the feelings of the Chinese people. But in that case, well, we can have our own exercise with Taiwan. We should be doing that. It'd be very useful in the event of some sort of natural disaster out here that we participate in, if we've got a record of participating. I think we should, I think we should consider, I hope we are, more of the latest technology for weapons systems. We should be, we already have joint training in some areas. I think that should be increased. I would like to see some Pentagon officials openly come here, high level. There are other things we could do. I mean, we should speak out more strongly about Taiwan. Every time that the PRC objects to something with regard to Taiwan, for example, the fact that Pompeo congratulated Tsai Ing-wen, our Secretary of State, congratulated Taiwan's newly elected president. The Chinese complained about it. I would like to see the press person get out there and speak more strongly about that stuff. When Wang Yi, the foreign minister of Hong Kong, makes a statement that we have to sever the black hands who are interfering in Hong Kong affairs, and then takes a swipe at the U.S. for what it's been doing, we should say this is nonsense, and it's not the kind of language that civilized countries use. It's particularly unfortunate at a time when there's so much Chinese PRC espionage going on inside the United States. We shouldn't let them get away with that kind of rhetoric used against us, and we just sort of supine and we take it. We've been doing that for far too many years, and we should talk back.
Well, how do you think the Trump administration has been handling Taiwan?
Well, clearly in a much better fashion in many ways, but I'm troubled by I don't know what Trump really thinks about Taiwan. I know he received a phone call initially, which I gather his staff advised him to do, from Tsai Ing-wen. It was a nice gesture. But for example, we know he then later went to Mar-a-Lago and he met with Xi Jinping. And he talked about how Xi Jinping had explained to him in just 2 minutes the whole history of Korea and how Korea had always been part of China. And I thought to myself, well, that's interesting. I'm sure the Koreans are going to be unhappy, and they were. But I thought to myself, surely they didn't meet for all that length of time in Mar-a-Lago, and he talked about Korean history as part of China, and he didn't talk about Taiwan. And subsequently, we've heard on one occasion, I don't remember the exact phrase, but there was something implying that, perhaps Taiwan could be a bargaining chip. Everything was negotiable, something along those lines. The people who have stood up most strongly have been people like Randy Shriver, Department of Defense, who's now left, Peter Navarro, who's on the trade negotiating team, Matt Pottinger in the NSC, John Bolton, who's now left the government, who's always been very strongly supportive. So that gave a certain complexion. I think Secretary Pompeo, I think his own views also are very supportive of Taiwan. But, it's been intermittent, and I guess maybe the president said something after the election just now of Tsai Ing-wen, but he should do more. But I guess he's so worried about getting a trade deal. But my own view has always been that I don't think we're ever going to get from the PRC the kind of trade deal we want and need: protection of intellectual property, ending subsidies to state-owned enterprises. And so I don't think, frankly, my own view is that trade is all that with China, PRC is all that important. The United States, if you look at the list of countries least dependent on exports of goods and services, U.S. is one of the least dependent countries, the lowest 10.
The Chinese Communist Party has threatened military action against Taiwan. If it actually came to that, what would the U.S. do?
Well, I'm always asked that, and, who knows? I mean, really, but my answer is we could no longer be the United States if we didn't step in and defend Taiwan. I mean, God knows we've fought wars in the name of democracy and fighting off communism in Vietnam. We went into Iraq because they had weapons of mass destruction, and they didn't. And by the way, people that I knew in the State Department who were following arms said that was the case. We stayed in Afghanistan to this day, and it's still a hodgepodge. And that was one of the motives, it was also against ISIS, but we've been involved in Syria. So if we can get involved in these kinds of conflicts, we certainly ought to support Taiwan. So otherwise we stop being the United States. That means we don't stand for principle. We just look after our own interests. And as I once said to an Australian scholar who was sort of brushing off the importance of Taiwan, I said, well, I can think of another country that's a democracy with only about 23 million people that we could brush off too. That would, of course, be Australia, but we're firmly consider them an ally. So, but even more important, perhaps for some people, if you don't care that much about principles or the nature of the United States, it's geostrategically important. One of the reasons China wants it is because then they put military bases on Taiwan and they extend their reach into the Western Pacific. And they rupture the first island chain of defense that General MacArthur famously talked about. So the other thing is, what are our allies? What is Japan going to think? What is Singapore going to think? Recently Indonesia and Malaysia in various ways have both expressed unhappiness with the 9-dash line. Are we just going to turn it all over? Once they control the South China Sea, or if they control it, and if they control Taiwan, basically Japan and South Korea, our allies and friends, are isolated, and China calls the shots, or PRC calls the shots.
Is it possible then for the U.S. to normalize relations with Taiwan, just treat it like any other country? Like, what would China actually do?
Well, I'd like to see that day come. I think there were mistakes way back during the time of Chiang Kai-shek where, Taiwan could have remained in the UN. That might have been changed by PRC eventually, but there could have also there were discussions of dual recognition. That was a possibility. So I think we've dropped the ball in the past. Whether we could pick it up in the future, I don't know. I'd like to see that day come because, in my view, Taiwan is clearly a country. It's a sovereign state. It's independent. They have elections, and it's a democracy. But I understand those who argue that we don't want to necessarily do anything that's going to provoke a conflict. What I always say is anything we do with regard to Taiwan that might lead to threats to Taiwan, and there are already enough threats, we should always consult very closely with Taiwan because they're in the best position to judge what is safe, what is doable. They have a better eye out and reading of what might happen. It sometimes worries me, for example, if some of my friends are big independence advocates, but that's all because they feel sure that the U.S. will come in and save the day. But One of the factors I think everybody realistically has to recognize is the PRC today is much stronger militarily, and it could be a very risky confrontation, not only for us but also for the PRC. I mean, we're not pushovers for sure.
I know you've called Taiwan a modern miracle. What does that mean?
All that it's accomplished in 40 years, the miracle that in about less than 4 decades, really, it went from poverty to prosperity, and it went from military dictatorship to democracy. And it's a model of democracy in Asia now, and for many other parts of the world. And it's done all of that. The real miracle is everything it's done without really any natural resources except the skills, the hard work, the education of its people. It didn't start off like the United States with a great river system and the largest plots of fertile land in the world, and with immigrants who could make America great because we would bring in skills as we needed them. It basically got a little bit of help from the United States and from others, from missionaries and people who came in the beginning. But by and large, it's been on its own. And it's been politically isolated since 1972. And yet they've accomplished all this. That's a miracle, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.